Now that we've got everything for the application to run, we just need to put it up on the internet so the world can see it. And to do that, we're going to be using Openshift. Openshift is provided by Red Hat, and it is a platform as a service cloud services provider that allows you to push applications up using Git and deploy onto their services. And they offer a great free tier. So what you'll want to do is click here on the sign up for free button and create your account. I've already done that, so I'm just going to log into my account and go to the web console. So once I've logged in, I need to create a new application. These ones are previous walkthroughs that I've done. So here we're going to just click that add application button. And what you need to do is type node, and that will provide you with a list of node applications that you can add. So we're going to click that, and I'm going to call this one Sails Financial. Underscore. And for now, we're not going to put a Git repository. This only works if you have a publicly visible Git repository. We only have private repositories, so that's not going to work. We don't need scaling, and we'll set our preference to put that on US East. Now we'll use a small gear, that's the free tier, and create the application. Oh, looks like only numbers or letters are allowed. So I'll just call it Sails for now. Okay, once that application completes, it's going to forward you on to a page that looks a little bit like this. It's going to have the address of a Git repository, and it's going to give you instructions for how to do that. Right now, we're not going to follow those instructions. We're going to go through something a little bit different. But what I want you to do is copy, and we'll put this in Notepad, copy the URL for the Git repository, because we'll be using that later to push our existing Git repository up to Openshift. So once we have that, we're going to go to the application overview page. The application overview page gives us a couple more options that we need to complete before we're ready to deploy our application. One of those is to add a database. You'll notice down here underneath the name of our cartridge, underneath the type of cartridge that we have a list of database options: MongoDB, MySQL, and PostgreSQL. We're going to add MySQL. So click that and add a cartridge. Okay, once we've added that cartridge, it's going to give us a database root user and a root password. We're going to record that also in our notepad, so we'll hold on to that for now. You probably want to keep track of that somewhere safe. Now, the last thing is we're going to add phpMyAdmin support. phpMyAdmin is an application that provides a prettier user interface for MySQL on the server end. It does something similar to what MySQL Workbench does, but this is a web-based interface that allows you to work with an application on a server. So once we've successfully added phpMyAdmin and MySQL, we're just going to pop on over in another tab. And this is going to require a username and password. The username and password are exactly those that you were given before. I'm going to not save that password. So now we have our database, and we can see there's a sales database here called Sails. There's a performance in MySQL and information schema. Those are provided by MySQL. What we need to do, just like we did on our local server, we already have the database here called Sails. Just like we did on our local server, we need to create a user to use just that database. We don't want to use our root user that has all privileges to add, drop, delete databases, just in case there's a security issue. So we're going to add a new user we'll call him Sails Financial. And we will allow him to access from any host. And the password will be "this is my password." So we don't need global privileges. That would be giving the user privileges on every database. So we're just going to move forward with that. And now we're going to give Sales Financial some privileges on the sales database that we've created. So once we're on the Sales Financial user privileges table, we're going to scroll down, and under database specific privileges, we are going to select the sales database. Now this is giving access to the sales database. Now what do we want them to be able to do? Obviously, select, insert, update, and delete information from the sales database. Regarding the structure of the database, I'm thinking create, alter, index, and drop would be valuable, along with locking tables and creating temporary tables. So once we've got that, we'll hit go. So that grants permission for the user Sales Financial to use the database, including selecting, deleting objects, records in the table, along with tables from the table as well, so the structure of our schema. So I'm going to open up WebStorm here, and we're going to talk through the database just a little bit. Once WebStorm is open, let's go under Config and look at connections. Currently, we have a connection here for Node Financial MySQL. That's the MySQL connection for our user. And under Models, you see that we tell the database to use that connection, and we tell it to alter. This migrate alter command in the models tells Sales that it is allowed to change the structure of the database. And that's great. That's fantastic when you're doing development, because when you add tables, when you delete tables, when you move things around, when you add columns to tables, you want Sales to automatically generate that in the database for you so that you don't have to worry about hopping over into MySQL Workbench and editing things manually. But in production, you don't want to do that. You don't want the database being altered, most importantly because that can result in you losing customer data when you don't specifically want to lose customer data. So we're going to do something a little different in our production environment, which is our Openshift environment. This option is going to automatically change to migrate safe. That's something that Sales does automatically in a production environment, and that tells Sales not to mess with the structure of the database. We can still add and delete records, but it's not going to add and delete columns. So even though we gave our database user permission to do that, we don't want to do it. In order to work with our database, we're going to need to tell MySQL through phpMyAdmin what the structure of the database is. And thankfully, MySQL Workbench provides an awesome and easy way to do that. What we're going to do is open up our Node Financial database. Let me double check here which one it is. The database is node_financial. So the database node_financial here contains our customer, investment, and stock objects. And we're going to go to data export. And we are going to export the Node Financial. And what we're going to do with that is export to a self-contained file, creating it in a single transaction. We don't need to include the create schema because we already have the database there, but we do need to include all of the tables. And then this just tells us where it's going to go. So it's going to go to documents, dumps, and then a name. And if I start the export, I'll just hit continue anyway. Now if I go over here to documents, dumps, and if I open this, this has all of the SQL that we need in order to create our customer, and it included all of our test data. If you hadn't wanted, click the wrong button there. If you don't want the test data, you can change this option to dump structure only, and that will dump only the structure. So we're going to start out our application with no test data. And I'm going to do that actually. I'm going to export with no test data. And that's a new file -1. And that just opened it in MySQL Workbench. Let's open it in a text editor. So I can right click and hit edit. And this creates the structure, all of the information that we need in our database. So now I'm going to select all of that and copy it and go back over to here, open up Sails, and I'm going to run some SQL. So this is our Sails database. And if I run currently, if I look at Sails, if I look at query, it says that there are no tables found in the database. So currently it's a completely empty database. When I copy and paste the SQL generated by MySQL Workbench on my computer, and when I click go, that runs. It says it returns an empty result set because there's nothing there. But when I hop over here, notice I now have user tables, customer, investment, and stock. So now the database on the server is ready. It's ready to listen and it's ready to work with our application. So the database is ready. Now we need to get our application up there. So we need to get the application up onto the server. And I told you already that we're going to do that using Git. We're going to do that all with Git. The first step to doing that is adding the public key from SSH from GitHub on our local computer onto Openshift so that we can authenticate with Openshift using that public key, using our private key in SSH. So we're going to go to Settings, and you'll notice I already have several keys on here. I'm going to add a new key, and I'm going to say GitHub work. That's going to be the name of the key. That can be whatever you want it to be. GitHub, when you downloaded the GitHub application, it installed two programs. It installed GitHub, which is what we have been using up till now, that wonderful interface, and it also installed Git shell. And Git shell provides a text-based interface for you to interact with Git. And in order to do that, in order for the Git shell to work, it can authenticate with your username and password with GitHub, or it can use an SSH public and private key pair. And it stores that public and private key pair in your user directory. So you're going to go to C drive, users, your username, and it creates a directory, if you didn't have one already, called .ssh. And when you open up that .ssh, there's going to be a GitHub RSA and a GitHub_RSA.pub. GitHub_RSA is your private key. GitHub_RSA.pub is your public key. Now, if you're like me and you have Publisher installed, it's going to want to open that in Publisher. I'm going to tell it to open with Notepad instead. And this right here, this long string of characters is my public key. So I'm going to Control-A, Control-C to select all and copy. And then I'm going to go back over here and paste. Back to the Openshift website, adding that public key. Make sure you're adding the public and not the private key onto the website. This lets us log in automatically using SSH to authenticate. So now that we are able to authenticate, the next thing that we need to do is combine the Git repository that was automatically created when we created our application with the Git repository that we have created and that we've been working on through all these tutorials. We're going to copy that SSH:, we already have it in a Notepad document, but I can copy it from here as well. And we're going to copy that. So what we need to do now is open up that Git shell. Now mine opened up in PowerShell, yours might open up in something else. That doesn't matter. The important thing that you need to do is navigate to the directory where you have stored your application. So to navigate to that directory, you're going to type cd, change directory, into wherever you need to go. So mine is in my username desktop folder. And if I type ls, I can see that I have my node financial. So I'm going to cd into node financial. And you'll note I now have master. That tells me that I am on the master branch in my project. So the next thing we need to do is add a new Git remote. Currently, we have a remote for GitHub that allows us to push. When you press that sync button in the GitHub application, that pushes your changes to GitHub. We're going to add a new remote, and we're going to call it Openshift. And we're going to do that by typing git remote add OpenShift -f. And then we're going to paste that URL that we've copied. And you can paste in PowerShell by right-clicking. If that's not working, you can open up the little menu up in the top left, edit, and paste. So once you've pasted that in there, you can hit return. And that updates our repository, adding a new remote destination called OpenShift. Now the next thing that we need to do is merge in the changes on the OpenShift repository, the remote repository, with the changes on our local repository. Now remember, OpenShift automatically created that remote repository, so there's really not much in it. But there are a couple of files and things that we'll need to get running on OpenShift. So in order for this to work, we need to pull down that application and combine it with all of the changes and everything that we've done in our local application. And the way you're going to do that is with a command called git merge. So we'll type git merge OpenShift, the name of the remote, /master, the name of the branch, -s, recursive, -x hours. Now what this tells it to do is when there is a conflict in this merge, it's going to default to using our repository, the local repository that we've created, namely all of our node financial code. So when we hit return there, it's going to pull all of that down, create a whole bunch of new directories. You can see it added a new README, a new directory called action hooks, and a new directory called cron, all in this new OpenShift directory, along with a few other new files as well. So we've now successfully combined our application with theirs. So we're not quite ready yet to push our application up. There's a few other changes that we need to make in our local application in order for it to work on the OpenShift side. So the first thing that we need to do on the local end to prepare our application for pushing up to the remote server is to create a new database connection. Now remember, Node Financial MySQL is the database connection that connects to our local database here on our local machine. And that's fine, but that's not going to work on the server because the server's in a different location. We've created a different user with different information, with a different username and password. So we're going to create that. Now, in a production environment in the real world, where you're pushing this repository out to and collaborating with other people, you're not going to want to put your password and your database connection information in this file inside of the repository, because that, again, is a security risk, especially if you're using a public repository. So there are other options that you can use, but for our application, in this case, and especially because we're using private repositories, we're in a little bit better shape, and we're just going to put our information right here. And the way that we do that is by creating a new connection in connections.js. And I'm going to call it OpenShift MySQL. I'm going to put an underscore there. And we're going to still use the adapter of sails.js. The user, if you'll remember, I called it Sails Financial. And my password was, not false. This is my password. Now, obviously, this is not secure. I'm storing this in a repository and I'm broadcasting it to the world. So again, this is not a secure storage for your password, but because we're taking all kinds of shortcuts here, we're just going to go with it. And we need to tell it the name of the database. And our database is also not called false. It is called sails. Now we still are missing just a little bit of information. And those 2 bits of information are host and port. And what we're going to be using to access the host and the port are called environment variables. And Openshift automatically inside of your environment creates environment variables that you can use to connect to your database that store information. Things like what the URL or the IP address of your database, your MySQL database is, or the port that your MySQL database is running on. And you want to use those environment variables because if you ever change that information, if you ever change the IP address or the port, that information can change and an environment variable can keep that up to date. So we're going to put in right here, we're going to say process.env OpenShift underscore MySQL underscore DB underscore host. And for port, very similar, process.env OpenShift MySQL DB port. And don't forget the comma. And now we have a new connection called OpenShift MySQL that we can use. Now previously we had specified in models.js our connection to the database. And that's how we told it to connect using Node Financial MySQL, our connection to our local database. Well, we want that to be different in a production environment. We don't want to have to mess with it here in our local environment. We still want to be able to connect to our development database without any issues. And thankfully, Sails provides environment-specific configuration. Under the config directory, there's a directory called env. And if you look in that directory, there are 2 files, development and production.js. Development.js is for the development environment. Since everything here is commented out, it's just going to use whatever we have in models.js. But in production.js, when Sails detects that they are in a production environment, which we're going to tell Sails to detect when we push it to OpenShift, then it will use this different configuration. So we're going to uncomment this line, and we're going to tell it to use the connection OpenShift MySQL. Let me just hop back over and double check. Yes, that is the one that we are using. So we don't need to set the port. We're going to do that in a different way, and we're not going to worry about the log level either. But we're just going to save that change. So now we have OpenShift MySQL, that new database connection connecting to our live database, ready to go. So the way that we're going to tell Sails that it is in a live environment when it's up on OpenShift is through the use of a file in our .openshift directory, specifically an action hook. Now currently you'll notice there aren't any action hooks there. So we're going to create a new file and we're going to call it pre-start node.js. And we're just going to tell WebStorm to open that file in WebStorm. And here we go. And here is what you want to put in that file. Now this is something that OpenShift runs before it runs your application, before it starts Node.js. It's a pretty simple name. And what this does is exports an environment variable called node.env for production. So that tells Sails and Node that you're running in a production environment, so you're going to want to use your production configuration. And then it's going to run our grunt files. And our grunt file, grunt specifically, performs a lot of the compilation and configuration of our application before it starts. So that's what allows us to automatically pull in those includes, things like the CSS and the JavaScript that we've included in our application. So we want that to be a part of our configuration. So before we push our application, before we're ready to go, we want to make a couple more changes to production.js. Specifically, we need to give it a little bit more information about our application in the real world. And those bits of information are going to be pulled from more environment variables, specifically the host. And the host here tells Sails our IP address. It tells us where we are located. And we also want to add the port. Process env Openshift node.js port. And this syntax here, you'll notice we have the name of the environment variable and then two pipes. And that is the symbol that's above the / key, which is right above your enter key. And what that tells us is if there is no environment variable called Openshift Node.js IP, then we'll just default to using localhost as the host. Similarly, if there's no Openshift Node.js port, then we will default to using 8080 as the port. And last, I'm going to get rid of that extra comma that I have, and we're going to save all of our changes. So we've now set up our connection to the database. We've set up our application defaults, including the IP address and the port. We've set up our environment to tell Node that we are in a production environment. So the only thing we have left is to commit. Now you could commit on the command line. And if we hit enter here, it'll tell us that we have some new files, some changes to files, or we can pop on over to our familiar Git interface and look at the changes. And if you look, we have pre-start Node.js, our new connection, and our production settings. So we're just going to commit those changes. We'll say configure production environment. Commit. And sync. Now this syncs our changes only to GitHub. That's the default sync location for committing here. The last thing that we'll need to do is to push it over to Openshift. If we hit enter back in the command line, we can see that the master has turned blue, which means that there aren't any local changes, and we're ready to go. So the command to push to Openshift is git push Openshift master. Remember, Openshift is the name of the remote that we created. We call it Openshift. Master is the branch on the remote that we want to push to. And when we push here, it will deploy our application. And of course, I forgot one thing. We need to install Grunt CLI. So, if we go back, let me just explain for a moment why we need this. If we go back over to package.json, we have a whole bunch of stuff here, a whole bunch of Grunt stuff here. Well, in our local environment, when we installed our application, Grunt, and specifically the command line interface for Grunt, was installed along with it. However, that is not present on Openshift. So we need to add it. And we need to specifically include that in our application. And the way we're going to do that is opening up a terminal, sails, npm install -- save grunt CLI. And if you open up and if you look at package.json, you'll notice that the grunt CLI is now included there where it was not previously. So we're going to commit that new change, just a tiny little change that'll make this work. and then go back over and push it again. Once the deployment process completes, you should have a fully functioning application that you can access on the web at sails-your username .rhcloud.com, or whatever the URL that they provided was. So now if we open this up and go to sails-rhcloud.com, that will pull up our application. And I can go to the customer list and see the list of customers. And I can go to new and create a new customer named Ryan Schetzler. Ryan at email.com, Nebraska, create, and that takes me to the customer page when I can add a stock just like everything else. So my fully functioning application is now up and running in the cloud. It's not pretty, but it's there.